The toast was a violation. Mr. Hollis, his face flushed with inferior claret, raised his glass. To the new Duke, and to a new era of prosperity for Kestrel Chase. The few remaining servants, gathered in the lesser hall, murmured a response. But Constance Bellamy remained silent, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the worn tapestry behind Hollis's head. A new era of prosperity, he said. For him, perhaps. For Kestrel Chase, it meant being carved up and sold for parts. For her, it meant the final erasure of her father's legacy. Constance was a ghost in this house, a remnant of a more glorious time. She was the daughter of Thomas Bellamy, the horsemaster who had made the Kestrel Chase stables the envy of the county under the old Duke. But her father was 5 years dead, the old Duke gone 10, and she, at 24, was little more than an unpaid clerk and seamstress, permitted to live in a small attic room out of a grudging sense of charity, managed by Mr. Randolph Hollis, the estate's interim agent. He was a distant cousin of the ducal line, a man whose ambition far outstripped his abilities, and he had been bleeding the estate dry for years. Her days were a litany of invisible labors. She mended the threadbare linens Hollis was too cheap to replace, balanced the ledgers he couldn't be bothered to understand, and wrote the letters his clumsy prose would have embarrassed. In return, she received a roof over her head and a constant, simmering disdain. He called her the girl, never Constance, and spoke of her father as a foolish sentimentalist who had wasted a fortune on horses. And oh, the horses. They were the heart of it all. After the toast, when the others had dispersed, Constance slipped out a side door, pulling her thin shawl tight against the evening chill. She did not head for the main house, but took the overgrown path toward the west wing, toward the abandoned stables. They stood like a great stone skeleton against the bruised twilight sky, their roofs sagging, their windows dark and empty. To Hollis, they were a useless relic, prime land to be sold to a factory developer from Marley. To Constance, they were a cathedral. She pushed open the groaning door of the main barn. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of old scents, sweet hay, worn leather, horse. Dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight slanting from a hole in the roof. She walked past the rows of empty stalls, her fingers trailing over the brass nameplates, tarnished but still legible. Stardust, Gallant, Northwind. Names like poetry, horses like legends. Her father had known them all, had bred them, trained them, loved them. At the very end of the row, one stall was not empty. A low nicker greeted her. Inside, a single, sway-backed mare with a coat the color of faded pewter pushed her soft nose into Constance's hand. This was Seraphina, the last of her father's line, too old and too valueless to be sold. Constance had cared for her in secret for 5 years, using her tiny allowance to buy oats and liniment, mucking out the stall herself, whispering stories of the old days into a soft, listening ear. "He's coming, old girl," she murmured, stroking the mare's velvety muzzle. "The new Duke, Gideon Severn." The name felt foreign, hard. He was a soldier, they said, a man who had seen too much of war on the continent and had no time for sentiment. He had been away for more than a decade, leaving the estate in the hands of men like Hollis. The rumors preceding him were of a cold, pragmatic man, interested only in ledgers and profit. He would see the stables exactly as Hollis saw them, a liability. "Mr. Hollis says his first order of business is to sell this land," she whispered, her voice catching for a moment before she steadied it. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Instead, she refilled Seraphina's water bucket, her movements economical and sure. She thought of her father's hands, calloused but gentle, showing her how to check a hoof for stones, She thought of his voice, deep and patient, explaining the delicate art of bloodlines, how courage and stamina could be woven together like threads in a tapestry. And she thought of the single, desperate gamble she had taken 3 years ago, using the last of her mother's meager inheritance to pay the stud fee for a visiting sire, a stallion with fire and strength, to cover Serafina. A foolish hope, a secret legacy. The colt, born a year later, had been sold off cheaply by Hollis before she could even truly assess him, bundled with other farm stock to a tenant farmer. She did not even know if he still lived. It was a loss she felt like a missing limb. Hollis's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "The Duke arrives Tuesday, the surveyors on Wednesday. He wants a full report on the demolition cost by Friday." It was happening. The end was not a threat. It was an appointment. Constance leaned her forehead against Serafina's warm flank, closing her eyes. She could feel the faint tremor of the old horse's breath. In the cavernous silence of the decaying stables, she made a silent promise to the ghosts, to her father, to this last, lonely mare. She would not let it all disappear without a fight. Even if no one saw her, even if no one cared. She would stand her ground, a quiet, solitary guardian of a forgotten kingdom, until the very last moment. The arrival of Gideon Severn, the 9th Duke of Severn, was an exercise in stark efficiency. There was no grand procession, no fanfare, just a single mud-splattered black carriage that rolled up the gravel drive without ceremony. A man emerged, tall and severe, dressed in dark, well-cut clothes that bore no hint of frivolity. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable, and a thin, pale scar cut a line from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent souvenir from the war. He was not a man who invited welcome. Mr. Hollis, sweating in his best waistcoat, scurried out to greet him, bowing and scraping. "Your Grace, welcome to Kestrel Chase. We are honored, truly honored, by your return." The Duke's gaze swept over Hollis, then past him to the house, taking in the peeling paint on the window frames and the weeds choking the formal gardens. "Honored," he repeated, the word flat and devoid of warmth. "Is that what you call this?" Hollis's smile faltered. We have managed as best we could, Your Grace. The economies required—" "Show me the estate," Gideon cut him off, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made Hollis flinch. For 2 days, the Duke was a silent, brooding presence. He walked every field, inspected every tenant farm, and spent hours in the estate office, poring over the ledgers Constance had so carefully balanced. She saw him only from a distance, a dark figure moving with purpose across a landscape that had known only neglect. He spoke little, and when he did, it was in short, direct questions that left Hollis stammering. On the 3rd day, the surveyors arrived. Their voices and measuring chains echoed from the west grounds, a death knell for the stables. Constance felt each shout like a physical blow. She was in the sewing room, mending a tablecloth, when a sudden, panicked whinny cut through the air. It was Serafina. The noise, the strangers, had frightened her. Without a second thought, Constance dropped the cloth, ignored Hollis's sharp, "Girl, where are you going?" and ran. She flew down the back stairs and out the door, her heart pounding. She found the mare circling her small makeshift paddock in a state of terror, her eyes wide and white-rimmed. The surveyors stood nearby, leaning on their tripods and laughing. "Careful now, old thing," one of them called. "Don't want to break a leg before you're sent to the knackers."
Constance ignored them. She slipped through the fence rails, murmuring in a low, soothing tone.
"Easy now, Sarah. It's just me. It's all right. I'm here." She didn't approach directly, but moved in a slow, deliberate circle, letting the mare see her, smell her. Serafina's panicked movements began to slow. Her ears, which had been pinned back in fear, flickered, then swiveled toward Constance. Finally, she stood still, trembling, as Constance reached out and laid a steady hand on her neck. "There now," she whispered, stroking the coarse gray coat. "Just noise. Nothing to fear." She was so focused on the horse that she didn't notice the man who had approached until he spoke, his voice a low baritone that cut through the surveyor's chatter. "Who are you?" Constance turned. It was the Duke. He stood not 10 feet away, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his eyes, a startlingly clear, pale gray, were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't looking at the crumbling stables or the frightened horse. He was looking at her, at the way her hand rested on the mare's neck, at the quiet confidence in her posture. Before she could answer, Hollis came puffing up behind him. "Your Grace, pay her no mind. This is just the Bellamy girl. Her father used to run the stables. She keeps the old nag as a pet. An unfortunate sentimentality." Gideon Severn did not look at Hollis. His eyes remained on Constance. "I asked her a question," he said, his voice dropping a fraction, yet gaining an edge of steel. "I expect her to answer it." The surveyors had fallen silent. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her and the Duke. Constance drew a breath. "My name is Constance Bellamy, Your Grace." "And what are you doing, Constance Bellamy?" "I am calming my horse," she said simply. "The strangers frightened her." He took a step closer, his gaze finally shifting to the mare, then to the single, mended stall visible through the open barn door. He noted the clean straw, the full water bucket, the neatly stacked hay. A tiny island of order in a sea of decay. It was a detail, a small, authentic act of competence that no one else had ever bothered to see. "Hollis," the Duke said, his back still to the agent, "you told me this place was derelict, abandoned." "It is, Your Grace, utterly. A ruin," Hollis insisted. Gideon's gaze returned to Constance. A flicker of something, not warmth, but perhaps appraisal, passed through his eyes. "It does not look entirely abandoned to me," he said. He looked from her steady hands to Hollis's sweating, agitated face. For the first time since his arrival, a long silence stretched, one in which Randolph Hollis was not the one in control. The Duke was looking at a problem, and for the first time, he seemed to suspect he had been given the wrong solution. The summons came an hour later, delivered by a footman with an air of profound shock. "His Grace the Duke requires your presence in the library, Miss Bellamy." Not the girl. Miss Bellamy. The change was as significant as an earthquake. Constance smoothed her plain gray dress, her hands steady though her heart was not. She walked through the grand corridors of Kestrel Chase, corridors she had only ever scurried through before, and entered the library. It was a magnificent room, lined with thousands of books, but it was cold, a fire unlit in the massive hearth. The Duke stood by the window, a silhouette against the gray light. Mr. Hollis was there too, positioned near the desk like a guard dog, his expression a mixture of fury and anxiety. "Your Grace," Constance said, her voice quiet in the vast room. "You sent for me?" Gideon turned. "Mr. Hollis informs me that the sale of the stable grounds to the Marley Textile Company is all but finalized. He says it will bring in a sum of £5,000, which the estate sorely needs." It is an excellent offer, Your Grace, Hollis interjected smoothly. A genuine opportunity to rid ourselves of a sentimental burden and modernize our finances. The Duke's gaze remained on Constance.
And you, Miss Bellamy? You do not seem to be a woman prone to unfortunate sentimentality. You seem practical. Do you agree this is an excellent offer? It was a test, a direct question that demanded a direct answer. Hollis shot her a look of pure venom, a silent command to agree and disappear. But Constance thought of her father, of Serafina, of the ghosts in the empty stalls. She would not lie, not even by omission. "No, Your Grace," she said plainly. "I do not." Hollis gasped. The girl is overwrought. Her attachment to the place clouds her judgment. "Let her speak," Gideon commanded, the words sharp as flint. He gestured to a chair. "Sit, Miss Bellamy, and tell me why £5,000 is not an excellent offer." It was the first time anyone of rank had offered her a seat in this house. She sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. "Because you are not selling a derelict building and empty pasture, Your Grace. You are selling a legacy. You are selling the future of Kestrel Chase for a pittance." She spoke not with passion, but with the cool precision she usually reserved for ledgers. She spoke of the Kestrel bloodlines, known throughout the kingdom for their stamina and heart. She explained that the stables, though neglected, were structurally sound, built of old stone and oak that could not be purchased for any price today. She told him of the unique chalk-filtered water from the well on the property, ideal for raising strong-boned horses. Then she rose, went to a dusty shelf, and retrieved a set of heavy, leather-bound books. "My father's ledgers, Your Grace." She opened one on the desk. The pages were filled with his neat, elegant script, detailing every birth, every sale, every race won. In its last profitable year under my father's management, this stable generated an income of £3,000. Not from selling land, but from creating life, from breeding champions. Gideon leaned over the book, his long fingers tracing a line of script. He was a man of evidence, a man who believed in what could be proven. He saw the numbers, the profits, the meticulous records of a master craftsman. He looked at the detailed genealogy charts, the notes on temperament and conformation. Hollis scoffed. "Ancient history. The man was a dreamer, I tell you. These bloodlines are dead and gone." "Not entirely," Constance said, her voice dropping slightly. "Serafina is the last of the Kestrel royal line, and her blood is still true." Gideon straightened up, his gray eyes moving from the ledger to Hollis's florid face to Constance's calm, determined one. He saw a choice. On one side, a blustering agent pushing a quick, easy sale. On the other, a quiet, serious woman with evidence in her hands and truth in her eyes. He had returned from a war where he had learned to spot the difference between a reliable report and a self-serving lie. He was silent for a full minute, the tension in the room stretching thin. Then he made his decision. It was abrupt, pragmatic, and utterly shocking. "Mr. Hollis, your advice is noted. You may leave us." Hollis stared, dumbfounded. "Your Grace." "Leave. Us." Sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, Hollis retreated from the library, slamming the door behind him.
The sound echoed in the silence. Gideon turned back to Constance. "You believe this place has potential?" It was not a question. "I know it does," she replied. "Then prove it." The words were a challenge, cold and hard. "The offer from the textile company stands for 6 months. You have until then. Make this place solvent. Show me a profit, even a single pound of it. You will have a budget of £50 for repairs and stock. Not a shilling more. You will report your progress and your accounting directly to me, every Friday. If you succeed, we will reconsider the sale. If you fail—" He let the sentence hang in the air.
"If you fail, the surveyors will return, and I will sign the papers."
Constance felt a dizzying mix of terror and triumph. It was an impossible task. A pittance of a budget, a ruin of a building, and a timeline of 6 months. But it was a chance. It was the only chance she had. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," she said, her voice unwavering. He gave a single sharp nod. "Very well, Miss Bellamy. The stables are your responsibility. Do not make me regret this decision." He turned back to the window, his posture once again remote, dismissing her. A reluctant transactional alliance had been forged. As Constance walked out of the library, she felt the weight of his trust, as cold and heavy and precious as iron. The transformation of the stables began not with a grand gesture, but with the scrape of a shovel and the scent of beeswax. Constance, armed with her £50 budget and an almost fanatical determination, did not try to reclaim the entire cavernous structure. She chose a small, defensible corner, a block of 6 stalls, the tack room, and the adjoining smithy. This would be her kingdom. Her first act was to hire help. Not a team of workmen, which she could not afford, but a single gnarled man named Jem, who had been one of her father's most trusted grooms. He was now relegated to tending the kitchen garden, his expertise with horses considered as obsolete as the stables themselves. When she found him, he was leaning on a spade, his face weathered and skeptical. "The Duke's given you 6 months and £50? He grunted, chewing on a piece of straw. "He's given you a shovel to dig the grave, is what he's done." "Perhaps," Constance replied, meeting his cynical gaze without flinching. "But I need someone to hold the other end of the shovel. My father said you were the best man he ever knew with a lame hoof or a nervous filly." Jem's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He looked from her earnest face to the distant, decaying roofline of the stables. He spat the straw from his mouth. £50, he muttered, as if to himself. "It's an insult. But your father, he was a good man." "All right, Miss Bellamy. I'll see what we can do. Don't expect miracles." It was not miracles she dealt in, but hard work. Together, she and Jem cleared away years of debris, mended broken stall doors with salvaged timber, and scrubbed the tack until the leather gleamed. Constance's hands, accustomed to needle and pen, became chapped and raw, but she never complained. Every evening she would present her meticulous accounts to the Duke. She would stand before his great desk in the library, her small ledger open, and detail every penny spent. 10 shillings for nails, £1 for lime wash, 5 for a load of fresh straw. Gideon would listen in silence, his face impassive. He would review her numbers, ask a single pointed question, "Is that the best price you could get for the oats?" and then dismiss her with a nod. There was no praise, no encouragement. Yet his attention was a form of fuel. He was watching. He was waiting. The £50 dwindled with alarming speed. Constance knew she needed more than a clean stable. She needed a horse.
a symbol of the future. Serafina was the past, but her blood held the key. Constance thought of the colt, the one sold off by Hollis. She spent a precious £1 on inquiries, sending letters to tenant farmers in the surrounding area. Finally, she found him. He was at a farm near Ottersley, half broken and considered difficult, used for pulling a cart. The farmer was willing to sell him for £15, a price that represented the near entirety of her remaining budget. When Jem saw the colt, he shook his head. The horse was lean, his coat rough, his eyes wary and defiant. He was all raw-boned potential, but he was far from a champion. "He's got your father's look in his eye," Jem admitted grudgingly. "But he's half wild, miss, and we've no money left for a proper trainer."
"I will train him," Constance said. She named him Steadfast. The training was a battle of wills. The colt was intelligent but mistrustful, fighting the bridle, resisting the saddle. Constance was endlessly patient. She spent hours in the round pen with him, not forcing, but inviting. She used her father's methods, based on trust and understanding, not fear and dominance. The Duke began to visit. He would not announce himself, but would simply appear, leaning against a fence post at the far end of the paddock, watching. He never offered advice, never interfered. He just observed her, a silent, solitary spectator. He saw her calm the colt after he shied at a falling leaf. He saw her persistence, going through the same motion 100 times until the horse understood. He saw the quiet, powerful bond forming between the woman and the animal. One cool evening, as dusk settled, he walked over to where she was rubbing the colt down. "He fights you," Gideon observed. "He tests me," Constance corrected gently. "He needs to know he can trust me." "And can he?" The question was soft, almost personal. "I keep my promises, Your Grace." He looked from her to the horse, whose ears were now soft, his head lowered in contentment as she worked. He then glanced back toward the main house, where a few more lamps seemed to be lit than usual. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abbott, a woman as grim and silent as the Duke himself, had started putting fresh flowers in the hall, a practice abandoned years ago. The air in the house felt less stagnant. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the absence of a certain chill. The quiet transformation of the stables was, in some small, unseen way, beginning to transform the master of the house as well. Gideon looked at the mended fences, the healthy horse, the determined woman before him. He was a man who believed in evidence, and the evidence was starting to accumulate. This was not a folly. It was an investment. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than the cold weight of duty. He felt curiosity. Just as a fragile seedling begins to push through the soil, so too did the first signs of opposition emerge, seeking to crush Constance's nascent hope. The news that the Duke had not only halted the sale of the stables, but had entrusted their revival to the Bellamy girl, spread through the county like wildfire. For most, it was a curiosity. For two people, it was an intolerable threat. The first was Mr. Randolph Hollis. Publicly overruled and privately seething, he saw Constance's small success as a direct assault on his authority and, more dangerously, a potential unraveling of his secrets. He needed the stables gone, the land sold, and the resulting influx of cash to blur the lines of the accounts he had been so creatively managing for years. He began his campaign quietly, with whispers in the village of Marley. "A shame about the Duke," he would say over a pint of ale at the inn. "The war has affected his judgment.
letting a slip of a girl, an emotional spinster, waste good money on a dead enterprise. The second and more formidable opponent was Lady Arabella Sinclair. Her father's estate bordered Kestrel Chase, and she had marked Gideon Severn as her own the moment he returned. She was beautiful, polished, and possessed of a will as strong and flexible as steel. She saw the title of Duchess of Severn as her birthright, and viewed Constance not as a rival, that would be giving her far too much credit, but as an unsightly piece of furniture that needed to be removed. Lady Arabella began to call frequently at Kestrel Chase, ostensibly to welcome the Duke back to the neighborhood. She would arrive in a gleaming carriage, her laughter echoing in the quiet halls. "Gideon, darling," she would say, linking her arm through his. "You must be so bored in this dusty old mausoleum. Let us ride."
My new mare is a beauty, a true Sinclair thoroughbred, not like the cart horse that little creature of yours is playing with in the mud. She directed her attacks at Constance with surgical precision, never being overtly rude, which would have been vulgar, but using 1,000 tiny cuts. If she saw Constance crossing the courtyard, her hands dirty from the stables, she would give a little laugh and say to the Duke, "Oh dear, one must be so careful with servants who get ideas above their station. They can become so dreadfully presumptuous." Constance felt the pressure mounting. The whispers from the village meant shopkeepers were suddenly less willing to extend her credit. The presence of Lady Arabella meant the Duke was often distracted, drawn away for rides and dinners. But the most direct attack came from Hollis. One morning, the new delivery of oats arrived for Steadfast. Constance, ever meticulous, inspected the sacks. They looked and smelled right. Yet, within a week, the colt's energy began to flag. His coat, which had been growing glossy and bright, turned dull. He became listless, refusing his feed. Constance was beside herself with worry. She checked his temperature, examined his legs, sat with him late into the night. Jem was equally perplexed. "I've never seen the like," he muttered, his face creased with concern. "It's as if the life is just seeping out of him." The sabotage was subtle, a slow poisoning. Hollis had arranged for the grain to be contaminated not with a fast-acting poison, but with a moldy, inferior grade of rye mixed deep within the sacks. A toxin that would slowly sicken the animal without being immediately obvious. It was a cruel, calculated move, designed to make the horse appear congenitally weak, proving Hollis's point that the Kestrel bloodline was finished and Constance's judgment was flawed. Lady Arabella saw her opportunity. She found the Duke watching the listless colt in his paddock, his face a grim mask. "You see, Gideon," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is what comes of indulging sentiment. The girl means well, I'm sure, but she is no expert. She has chosen a weak, flawed animal. My father says the kindest thing to do for such a creature is to put it out of its misery. And," she added, her eyes gleaming, "it would put an end to this rather embarrassing experiment." Constance, approaching from the stables, overheard the last part of the exchange. She saw the flicker of doubt in the Duke's eyes. He looked at the sickly horse, the symbol of his wager, and for the first time, his faith seemed to waver. All the old, hard pragmatism she had first seen in him was resurfacing. The world was a place of hard truths, and the truth before him seemed to be a failing horse and a failed project. The opposition was no longer just whispers and slights. It had drawn blood. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The local veterinarian, a man named Farlow, whom Constance had long suspected of being in Hollis's pocket, confirmed their worst fears.
He examined Steadfast with a show of great solemnity, tutting and shaking his head. "It's the breeding, I'm afraid," he declared, wiping his hands on a cloth. "A congenital weakness of the constitution. You see it sometimes when a line gets too old. There's nothing to be done." "The humane course of action, Your Grace," he said, turning to Gideon, who had been observing the proceedings in stony silence, "is to have him put down." The words struck Constance like a physical blow. Put him down. End the dream. Admit defeat. Lady Arabella, standing beside the Duke, placed a delicate, proprietary hand on his arm. "It's for the best, Gideon. A sad business, but necessary." Everything was converging. Hollis's rumors, Arabella's social pressure, and now this damning professional opinion. The 6-month experiment was collapsing into failure.
Gideon's gaze, when it fell upon Constance, was cold, shuttered. The brief connection they had forged over weeks of quiet observation seemed to have evaporated. He was once again the soldier, the pragmatist, cutting his losses. "The animal is sick," he stated, his voice flat. "The vet advises ending its suffering. The project has failed, Miss Bellamy." This was the moment of crisis, the fracture point. Every instinct told Constance to plead, to weep, to beg for more time. But tears were a currency she did not possess. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. The quiet dignity that was her only true armor settled over her. "The vet is mistaken, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly level. Farlow scoffed. "My dear girl, I have been a veterinarian for 20 years. "He is not sick from his breeding," Constance continued, speaking only to the Duke. "He has been poisoned. Slowly." A stunned silence fell over the group. Lady Arabella let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Poisoned? How absurdly melodramatic. The girl is hysterical." Gideon's eyes narrowed, searching Constance's face. He saw no hysteria. He saw a terrifying certainty. "On what grounds do you make such an accusation?" he demanded. "Evidence," she replied. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it to reveal a handful of oats, interspersed with dark, slightly shriveled kernels of rye. "This is from the bottom of the last feed sack. It is tainted with ergot, a fungus. It doesn't kill quickly. It weakens. It dulls the mind. It mimics a wasting sickness." She then produced her own small ledger, the one she kept just for Steadfast. "And this is my record of his health. His feed intake, his energy levels, the gloss of his coat. The decline began exactly 4 days after we opened the new delivery of oats from the supplier Mr. Hollis recommended." She had not accused Hollis directly. She did not need to. She had simply laid out the facts, one by one, like stones in a foundation. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was meticulously documented. It was her word, her competence, against theirs. "This is preposterous," Farlow blustered. "She has no proof." "I am asking for a chance to get it," Constance said, her gaze locked on Gideon. The world fell away. There was only the Duke, his face an inscrutable mask, and her, holding the truth in her hands. "I do not trust Mr. Farlow's diagnosis. There is a man in Ottersley, an equine specialist named Gilbert. My father considered him the most honest veterinarian in the county. Give me 1 day, Your Grace. Allow me to bring him here. Let him examine the horse and the feed. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to trust the process of finding the truth." She took a breath. "Plainly, I am asking for your trust." The word hung in the air between them.
plainly. A simple word, but it had become a quiet touchstone in their stilted conversations. It meant cutting through the noise, the performance, the lies. Gideon's perspective. He felt the weight of their expectations. Arabella's on his arm, soft but insistent, urging him toward the sensible, socially acceptable path. Hollis's, though he was not present, hung in the air, the expectation of a master who puts profit before sentiment. Farlow's, the expectation of a professional whose opinion should be final. They were all pushing him toward one conclusion. The experiment was over. Liquidate the asset, move on. It was the logic of the battlefield, the cold arithmetic he had lived by for 10 years. And then there was Constance Bellamy. She offered no soft touch, no appeal to his status. She simply stood there, her back straight, and presented facts. A handful of grain, a ledger, a quiet, unshakable belief in her own competence. He looked at her, and he did not see the hysterical servant Arabella described. He saw the same woman who had calmed a panicked horse with nothing but her voice.
He saw the woman who had scrubbed floors and mended fences, who accounted for every penny, who had coaxed a spark of life back into a place that had been dead for a decade. He had spent years surrounded by men who told him what he wanted to hear, who offered easy solutions that often concealed rot. He had learned, the hard way, to trust the evidence of his own eyes over the soothing words of others. His eyes told him that Constance Bellamy was not a liar. His eyes told him that the look on Farlow's face was one of blustering insecurity, not professional confidence. He felt Arabella's fingers tighten on his arm. "Gideon, this is foolishness. Let us be done with it." He looked down at her hand, then back to Constance. In her eyes, he saw not a plea for mercy, but a demand for justice. It was not pity she was asking for. It was something harder and more respectful. It was a partnership in finding the truth. She had offered him a choice, their world of convenient lies, or her world of difficult facts. In that moment, he knew which world he wanted to inhabit. He had been living in the cold, empty rooms of Kestrel Chase, a house as shuttered and numb as his own heart. Her quiet, relentless work in the stables had been the first thing to let a little light in. To abandon her now would be to snuff out that light and retreat back into the gray numbness. He gently removed Arabella's hand from his arm. He took a step forward, closing the distance to Constance. He looked from her steady gaze to the nervous, shifting eyes of the vet. He made his choice. "You have your day, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. The authority was back, but this time it was wielded in her defense. "Send for your man from Ottersley. No one is to touch this horse or enter these stables until he arrives. Is that understood?" He directed the last part to Farlow, his tone leaving no room for argument. The vet paled, stammering an affirmative. Lady Arabella stared at him, her beautiful face a mask of cold fury. She had lost, and she knew it. Gideon Severn had chosen the stable girl's word over hers. He had chosen evidence over influence. He turned and walked away without another word, the decision made. He did not know if she was right about the poison, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she had earned the right to find out. The day that followed was one of taut, suspended silence. True to the Duke's word, the stables were placed under a de facto quarantine. Jem, his face set in grim lines, stood guard at the main door, armed with a pitchfork and a lifetime of loyalty to the Bellamy name.
Constance did not leave Steadfast's side, bathing his forehead with cool water and trying to coax him to drink. The life of the horse and the future of her world hung in a delicate balance. Late in the afternoon, a gig rattled up the drive. It carried a small, wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose and a kindly, intelligent face. This was Mr. Abel Gilbert, the veterinarian from Ottersley. He greeted Constance with a warm, respectful handshake. "Your father was a great man, Miss Bellamy. If you have half his eye for a horse, then we're in good hands." Gilbert's examination of Steadfast was a world away from Farlow's cursory pronouncement. It was methodical, gentle, and intensely thorough. He listened to the horse's heart and lungs for a long time. He examined his gums and eyes. He took a sample of his blood. Then, he turned his attention to the feed. He sifted the grain through his fingers, sniffed it, and finally produced a small magnifying glass from his bag, peering intently at the dark kernels Constance had isolated. After nearly an hour of silent work, he straightened up. The Duke had appeared, as was his custom, standing silently at the edge of the stable yard. Mr. Gilbert addressed both him and Constance. "Miss Bellamy's assessment is correct," he stated, his voice calm and factual.
The horse is not suffering from a congenital defect. He is suffering from ergotism. It's a classic case. The listlessness, the dull coat, the refusal to eat. Someone has been feeding him contaminated rye. He held up the magnifying glass. The proof is right here. It's a deliberate act, and a cruel one. Constance let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Vindication. It was a quiet, clean feeling, devoid of triumph, but filled with a profound sense of relief. Gideon's face was like granite. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Send your bill to the house." "Miss Bellamy," he said, turning to her, "you have your truth. Now I will have mine." He turned and strode back toward the main house, a man on a mission. What followed was a swift and ruthless house-cleaning. Gideon did not confront Hollis publicly. Instead, he dispatched a rider to the county seat to fetch an independent auditor. For 2 days, the auditor was locked in the estate office with the Duke and the ledgers. The results were exactly as Constance's evidence had suggested. Years of systematic embezzlement, falsified records, and kickbacks from suppliers, including the very grain merchant who had provided the tainted oats. Mr. Farlow, the vet, was also implicated, having received loans from Hollis for years in exchange for his cooperation. Hollis's ruin was quiet but absolute. There was no dramatic scene. He was simply informed one evening that his position was terminated and that charges of fraud were being filed with the magistrate. He was gone by morning, his hurried departure the only sign of his disgrace. Dr. Farlow's practice similarly dissolved overnight as word of his complicity got out. In the midst of this quiet storm, Lady Arabella Sinclair made one final, desperate play. She cornered Gideon in the drawing room, her voice laced with a venomous sweetness. "Gideon, you can't possibly be taking this seriously. You've dismissed a man of good family on the word of a servant. It's a scandal. What will people say?" Gideon, who had been staring into the fire, turned to face her. His expression was cold. "They will say that at Kestrel Chase we value honesty over breeding. They will say that we pay our debts and we protect our own. Miss Bellamy has shown more integrity and honor in 6 weeks than Mr. Hollis has in 6 years. I find her word to be of impeccable value." He paused, his gaze unwavering.
I am afraid I no longer find the same to be true of yours, Lady Arabella. Good evening. It was a dismissal from which there was no recovery. Arabella left Kestrel Chase that day and was not seen in the district again for a very long time. While the human drama played out, Constance and Jem focused on the real victim. With a new supply of clean feed and a regimen prescribed by Mr. Gilbert, Steadfast began to recover. The light returned to his eyes. His appetite came back with a vengeance. The colt seemed to possess a deep well of resilience, and as his strength returned, a new fire began to burn in him. He was no longer just a horse. He was a survivor. Constance began his training in earnest. The bond between them, forged in sickness and adversity, was now unbreakable. The colt moved with a newfound grace and power, his stride long and effortless. He seemed to understand that she had saved him, and he gave her everything she asked. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Constance was putting Steadfast through his paces in the main paddock, another carriage arrived. This one belonged to Lady Theodosia Drummond, a formidable dowager from a neighboring estate, known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper eye for horseflesh. She had been a contemporary and a friendly rival of Constance's father. She watched, unannounced, from her carriage for a quarter of an hour before ordering her driver to stop. She beckoned Constance over. "That's a Bellamy horse, no doubt about it," she said, peering at Steadfast through a lorgnette.
Got your father's stamp all over him. Good bone, great heart. She looked at Constance, her eyes shrewd. "I hear you've had some trouble." Constance simply nodded. "We are managing." More than managing from the looks of it." Lady Theodosia tapped her chin. "The King's Cup is in 6 weeks, the biggest race in the north. The prize money would solve a great many of your problems." Constance's heart skipped a beat. The King's Cup was a legendary race for the finest 3-year-olds in the country. It was an impossible dream. "He is unregistered, my lady, and I haven't the funds for the entry fee." Lady Theodosia smiled, a rare and fearsome thing. "Leave the registration to me. I still have some influence with the Jockey Club, and I will sponsor his entry." She saw the shock on Constance's face. "Don't look so surprised, girl. Your father once gave me a piece of advice that won me £1,000. Consider this a debt repaid. Besides," she added, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "I should very much like to see the look on the faces of all those fools who said the Kestrel line was dead." Her public vote of confidence was a gauntlet thrown down to the entire county. The stable girl and her poisoned colt were going to the King's Cup. The day of the King's Cup dawned bright and cold. The racecourse at Dunsmuir was a churning sea of high society, a spectacle of silks, velvets, and flashing jewels. It felt a world away from the quiet, dusty reality of the Kestrel Chase stables. Constance had traveled with Steadfast and Jem in a hired horsebox, feeling small and out of place amidst the grandeur. Steadfast was an unknown, a ghost entry with impossibly long odds. The official program listed his sire and dam, but under owner, it simply read Kestrel Chase Stables. In the paddock before the race, the air was thick with tension and the smell of money. Grooms in smart livery paraded magnificent, high-strung thoroughbreds, their coats gleaming like polished chestnuts. And then there was Steadfast. He was not as large or as flashy as the others, but he stood with a quiet solidity, his intelligent eyes taking in the chaos with an unnerving calm. Constance, dressed in her best but still plain dark wool dress, stood at his head, murmuring to him, her presence a small island of tranquility. She was aware of the stares and whispers. "That's the one.
The horse from Kestrel Chase. They say the Duke's mad, being run by his stable girl. The gossip eddied around her, but it could not touch her. Her entire focus was on the horse. She saw the ducal party arrive in the owner's enclosure. Gideon stood tall and remote, a stark figure in black. Lady Theodosia was beside him, looking utterly unconcerned, pointing out various horses with the tip of her cane. Constance noted, with a distant pang, that Gideon had not sought her out. He had supported her, defended her, but here, in this public arena, a chasm of class and expectations still separated them. Jem, who had secured the services of a young, hungry jockey named Tam, gave her a nod. "It's time, miss." Constance gave Steadfast one last pat on the neck. "Just run your race," she whispered. "Show them who you are." As the jockey was lifted into the saddle, she caught Gideon's eye across the paddock. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of encouragement. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact. Here we are. Let the evidence speak. The race itself was a blur of thundering hooves and roaring crowds. Steadfast, the outsider, got a clean start but settled into the middle of the pack. The favorites, a fiery bay owned by a viscount and a massive chestnut belonging to a banking dynasty, set a blistering pace, battling for the lead. The commentators barely mentioned Steadfast's name. For most of the race, he was just another horse in the field. Constance stood by the rail, her hands clenched, her knuckles white. She did not watch the leaders.
She watched her horse. She saw his rhythm, the steady, ground-eating stride she had worked so hard to develop. He was not wasting an ounce of energy. He was running his own race, just as she had taught him. As they rounded the final turn, the two leaders began to falter. The punishing pace had taken its toll. The crowd groaned as the Viscount's bay began to fade. It was then that Tam, the young jockey, made his move. He asked Steadfast for more, and the horse responded. It was not a sudden, explosive burst of speed, but a relentless, determined surge. He moved up from 5th to 4th to 3rd. The commentator's voice, which had been focused on the duel at the front, rose in surprise. "And what's this? On the outside, it's the unknown, Steadfast, making a late charge." He devoured the ground, his heart and lungs pumping in perfect sync. He passed the banker's flagging chestnut. He drew level with the Viscount's bay. For 100 yards they ran neck and neck, a battle of a celebrated champion against an unknown contender. But Steadfast had something the other horse did not. He had fought back from the brink of death. He had a deeper well of courage to draw from. In the final 50 yards he pulled ahead, by a head, then a neck, then a full length. He crossed the finish line first. A wave of stunned silence washed over the crowd, followed by a roar that shook the grandstand. The long shot, the ghost, the stable girl's horse, had won the King's Cup. Constance did not cheer. She simply let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the rail, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. It was done. She had won. Vindicated. Through the throng of people rushing toward the winner's circle, she saw a figure moving with singular purpose. It was Gideon. He wasn't walking toward the officials or the presentation stand. He was walking directly toward her. He moved past astonished lords and ladies, past a slack-jawed Lady Theodosia who was now beaming with triumph, and did not stop until he was standing directly in front of Constance. The roar of the crowd, the chaos, the celebration, it all faded into a muted hum. There was only the Duke, his pale gray eyes burning with an emotion she had never seen in them before. He stood before her, a duke before a commoner, yet in that moment, all rank seemed to fall away.
The noise of the crowd was a distant sea. In the charged space between them, there was only the culmination of months of shared purpose, of silent observation, of a trust that had been tested by fire and held true. His face, usually a mask of control, was stripped bare. She saw respect. She saw admiration. She saw something more, something deeper and more staggering that made her breath catch in her throat. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His gaze was a physical force, holding her, honoring her. "The stables are yours, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice low but carrying with perfect clarity over the din. "For as long as you will have them." It was a statement of victory, a public declaration of her triumph. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. But he was not finished. He took a half-step closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear the words, a private oath in a public space. "And so is Kestrel Chase. And so am I." It was not a flowery proposal from a romance novel. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same plain, unadorned honesty he valued above all else. "I am yours." A declaration, a surrender, a choice. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Constance, who had faced down ruin and sabotage without shedding a tear, felt her eyes well up. She gave a single, watery, brilliant smile. "Plainly, Your Grace?" she whispered, the word a secret password between them. "Plainly," he confirmed, his own lips curving into the faintest, most genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "Gideon," he corrected her softly. "Gideon," she repeated, and in the saying of his name, the world shifted on its axis and settled into a new, more hopeful alignment. The aftermath was swift. The story of the poisoned colt who won the King's Cup became a local legend. The prize money, a staggering £2,000, was enough to secure the future of the stables for years to come. Constance, with the Duke's full backing, began the slow, careful work of restoring the entire facility, not just her small corner of it. She purchased 2 promising young mares, laying the foundation for a new dynasty of Kestrel Chase champions. Mr. Hollis was tried and convicted, his name forever stained by his greed and cruelty. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a quiet and ignominious end to his ambitions. Gideon and Constance's courtship was as unconventional as its beginning. It was not conducted in ballrooms or drawing rooms, but in the crisp air of the stable yard and over dusty ledgers in the library. He learned the language of horses from her, and she learned the landscape of his guarded heart. He told her of the war, of the loss and betrayal that had sealed him away from the world. He told her that her unwavering honesty had been the key that had finally unlocked the door. "I had forgotten what it was like to trust someone's word without reservation," he confessed one evening, as they stood watching Steadfast graze in the twilight. "You reminded me." He took her hand then, his fingers lacing through hers. It was the first time he had touched her with deliberate, personal intent. His hand was warm and strong around hers, a silent promise of partnership and protection. It was the beginning of everything. 1 year later, the Kestrel Chase stables were no longer a skeleton. They were vibrant and alive, the stone walls echoing with the soft nickers of a dozen fine horses. The scent of sweet hay and leather was no longer a ghost, but a living perfume. The grounds of the estate, once choked with weeds, were now immaculately kept, the gardens bursting with roses and lavender. Kestrel Chase was breathing again. It was a home. Constance, now the Duchess of Severn for 6 months, walked with her husband through the paddocks, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows. She was not dressed in silks or satins, but in a practical, well-cut riding habit. In her hand, she carried a small, familiar object. An old leather bridle, its brass fittings polished to a soft gleam, the leather supple and cared for. It had belonged to her father. They stopped at the fence of the main pasture, where Steadfast, the champion, grazed peacefully alongside 2 new foals. He lifted his head and trotted over, nudging Gideon's shoulder before pushing his soft muzzle into Constance's hand. "He still prefers you," Gideon noted, his voice laced with a dry, affectionate humor that she had come to adore. "He has excellent judgment," she replied, her eyes twinkling. From the direction of the house, they saw 2 figures approaching. One was Jem, his gnarled posture a little straighter these days, his title restored to head groom. The other was her younger sister, Phoebe, who had come for a long visit. Phoebe had been shallow once, caught up in the social whirl that had scorned Constance. But seeing her sister's triumph, seeing the genuine love and respect she now commanded, had been a humbling education. She looked at Constance now with a new, quiet admiration. "The farrier is here for the foals," Jem announced. "And Mrs. Abbott says dinner will be in an hour," Phoebe added, smiling. "She's making your favorite, Gideon. Roast pheasant." The gruff housekeeper, Mrs. Abbott, was now fiercely protective of her new duchess, and had become almost cheerful, a transformation the rest of the staff considered the greatest miracle of all. "We'll be there shortly," Gideon said. As Jem and Phoebe headed back, Gideon turned to Constance, his arms sliding around her waist.
He drew her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses, the tangible proof of their shared life. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The fight?" Constance thought for a moment, her cheek resting against the rough wool of his coat. She thought of the cold, desperate nights, the weight of imminent failure, the sting of humiliation. Then she thought of the thrill of proving them all wrong, the clean satisfaction of competence, the moment she saw the truth dawn in her husband's eyes. "No," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "I have everything I fought for, right here." He tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to her hair. The setting sun bathed the fields in a warm, honeyed light. The world was peaceful, ordered, and safe. It was not an ending won by magic or by rescue, but one that had been built, piece by piece, with steady hands, an honest heart, and a faith in the quiet power of steadfast, unwavering love. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.